if you do something a lot and then you focus very hard on it.
Yeah.
Artists will do this, and you hear about artists and writers sitting down to like write something and then they don't get up for 36 hours.
Huh.
Like Stephen King would do that, and that's a flow state. You
I thought
can't
that
do
was the
that
cocaine
normally.
also.
That was the cocaine, and that brings me to an interesting point. The Vikings did it with henbane.
Okay, I was going to ask you because I heard is it hembane? I thought it was mushrooms.
So the mushrooms hypothesis is a compelling one, but I don't think there was an ethnobotanist, which is a job that I didn't know you could have. It's pretty cool, but an ethnobotanist figured out that the mushrooms necessary for that wouldn't have been growing in enough quantity at the time.
Okay.
And so his counter was that they probably used henbane, which was everywhere.
What is henbane?
It's this small, I believe it's like a little brush type of herb, and it's actually pretty poisonous to you. But if you ingest it, it is hallucinogenic to an extent, and it's not just hallucinogenic. It makes you angry.
And so it makes you a violent hallucinogen. And did they ever have difficulty telling friend from foe and all that?
Oh yeah, that happened. From what I could tell. The thing is, though, that in modern, they kind of disregarded henbane for a while because in modern toxicology studies, henbane just kind of makes you like lethargic and irritable, I believe were the words used. Not, ragingly angry and meditative. And they're also hesitant to do it because it's part of the nightshade family, and therefore is poisonous. But
you've also got these like Viking guys who probably got some sort of tolerance to it and got used to it, and maybe they knew how to prepare it a little bit better.
Well, definitely, and there's also the fact that I don't think like that ethnobotanist thinks that it was basically just the henbane. I don't think it was just the henbane. I think it's the henbane plus the ritual plus the removal from society. And if you did that today with people that were, militaristic or fighters of some sort, you'd probably get pretty similar effects. But nobody wants to die of a nightshade poisoning, so I'm not willing to try it. I'll say that. Like, I'm not going to
lie. I'm curious, but probably not going to happen.
The other piece of evidence for henbane was that after berserking, guys would often spend 2 or 3 days like alone in a dark hut because they'd be like violently ill.
Interesting.
Yeah, they'd be sensitive to light. They'd have headaches. They'd throw up.
Oh,
and
that's something like they're coming down off of something.
Yes, that doesn't happen with mushrooms.
No, it does not.
Welcome to the Furrowed Brow with Jeffrey Kipler.
So is this the Alaric name, Alaric? I looked it up. Like, I think I actually used ChatGPT to explain it to me, but it was like a guy who invaded Rome or took over Rome or something like that.
Yeah, he sacked Rome in 410. And
yep, that was the guy.
Yes, he was the first king of the Visigoths. And as a German or Roman general, I'm sorry, I'm frazzled at the moment with the technology issues earlier. But as a Roman general, he had repeatedly asked for territory and space and rights to govern his people, but he had repeatedly been denied, and eventually he just went on a tear through Roman territory and eventually sacked Rome.
Oh shit! All right, well, they give the guy the territory, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. So, do you have, before we really get into this, do you have any questions for me or?
Off the top of my head, no. I thought, let's just see where the conversation goes.
Awesome.
So.
Well, then let's get into it here. Welcome to the Furrowed Brow. Today we are diving into the depths of history, philosophy, and the human experience with guest Alaric. We're not sure about the pronunciation because, well, who he's named after can't dispute that anymore. But Alaric the Barbarian, as he goes by on Twitter, and his thought-provoking substack. In his writing, Alaric explores the warrior ethos across cultures, the impact of technology on our connection to the past, and old and new in warfare, and the role of martial arts in our lives. So, Alaric, welcome to the Furrowed Brow.
Thank you for having me on. I'm very happy to be here and, talk about this stuff. I'm very glad to have an audience for it. I never thought this many people would be interested.
No, so yeah, like how did you get started in writing all of these different things in terms of warfare? Like you have deep insights into martial arts training, into warfare. What's your background with this? How did you develop your knowledge of these areas?
Well, I'd say it definitely started at the earliest with martial arts because I started training as a kid. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. I started doing, karate. Went eventually into kickboxing, jiu-jitsu, MMA,
Oh
all
wow,
of
you've done a
that.
lot.
Yeah, I've with training, I've been around the block with a couple of different arts, and as a result, I think I have a unique, I guess, view on the martial arts world, and I didn't realize that I did. In all honesty, I just started tweeting about stuff that I found interesting under the name, and I had been on social media for a long time, but I had never really taken it seriously and tried to put out serious pieces of writing until
Hmm.
pretty recently, and obviously people were interested. So I was surprised and very happy about that. And now I'm trying to continue, growing an audience and writing about the stuff I'm interested in, I guess.
So, I mean, do you have any like military experience? What inspired your interest in exploring the spiritual and philosophical aspects of warfare?
Well, the spiritual and philosophical end came more from I'm not a veteran. I don't have military experience. I've just trained fighting. Um, but the spiritual and philosophical end really came out of an interest in history and realizing that how history was primarily being represented seemed quite different from how primary sources or the people of the time actually viewed things, specifically with war and warfare, because that's one of the realms that were very philosophically, I'd say, divorced from the past view on it. We don't, ever since really World War I was the turning point, but we don't valorize or spiritualize or philosophize in the same way about warfare and combat, and that extends all the way down to any form of conflict. We're generally a conflict avoidant culture at the moment,
I mean,
and
do
I
you?
think we lose a lot with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no super history buff, but my understanding is that World War One and really even maybe the Civil War before that was the first real large scale mechanized combat where it really changed the game. Does that resonate with you?
Definitely the meat grinder of World War I in particular uh, blew out of the water a lot of notions about individual valor, or heroism, or I mean the poem, just the poem Dulce et Decorum Est, satirizing the whole idea of dying for one's country and the idea of valorizing, uh, let's say, a beautiful death or a noble death, like say the Greeks did.
Yeah.
And that arose as a very real reaction to a horrific turn in warfare that nobody had the tactics or knowledge to adapt to. But as a result, we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater there and lost a lot of other elements of warrior philosophy in the process. I don't think it was just that, but that was for the First World War and later on conflicts probably were the single biggest determining factor in that.
And what are these? How would you describe these things that were lost?
Well, there are a lot of very how does one say this, traditional topics that are kind of non-mainstream now. For example, the idea of conquering as a good thing or a noble
Hmm.
thing, the idea of claiming dominance or of struggle as a way to develop yourself. Even the very idea of measuring up and competition has been gradually, especially over the past 30 years, sort of pushed out of the popular consciousness. And it's an interesting shift, and I think that it primarily, for example, primarily my audience on Twitter is male. Men tend to lose the most from that,
Hmm.
and when you eliminate things like competitive culture, athletics, the interest in warfare, we make these things taboo. it sort of goes against the male psyche because we've been built for that since 50,000 BC.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I was the geek and the nerd growing up. I wasn't really athletic whatsoever. Very, you know, so I played Dungeons and Dragons, so I was a legitimate LARPer, and only got into martial arts, jujitsu, recently. And I can say that I'd watched UFC since like the '90s and whatnot, but which the reality of knowing that you're right or wrong and having something not be intellectually true but absolutely true that you find out from combat is a much different situation than bullshitting arguments and waxing philosophical about things that have no consequence.
Yeah, absolutely. And in all honesty, I wasn't, a jock, so to speak, from a young age. I wasn't, a hyper athletic guy, but I was always into the fighting, always wanted to get better and train. And I think the real turning point was when I was probably around 14 and I started kickboxing, and the people I was sparring with were just 2, 3 times my size.
Yep.
And I realized a lot of things about martial arts and a lot of things about fitness and life when that happened. Namely, that a lot of the ways that we adapt traditional martial arts philosophy today is just wrong. A lot of the movies and media around the idea of combat are just LARP in the bad way.
Wrong in LARPing
Yeah.
how?
Well, when you have there's this famous, I think it was a tweet from 5 or 6 years ago, talking about movies where every time you turn a movie on, you have 115-pound Angelina Jolie beating up
Oh,
225-pound Marines. And it's like,
yeah.
all right,
Yeah.
it's this idea of, we kind of took the concept of the underdog and made it the mainstream.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we sort of adapted ideas from traditional martial arts that were very nuanced, and we made them very simple. For example, the idea that like size or strength doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's at its face, it's absurd, but a lot of people genuinely believe this.
Yeah.
And I think it's turned recently, especially, and I'm talking grand scale recently, so past like 10 years, 15 years with UFC. It's
Yeah.
turned a lot, and with internet visibility of martial arts. But I mean, there's still people out there training Aikido and thinking that it makes them more combative. And it's just an interesting thing because I think it's a subset of a larger culture that's in many ways based around the denial of reality and the valorization of what should be rather than what is.
Yeah, I mean, my big struggle in jujitsu is like I'm 6'1", 230, 240, depending upon the day. And I'm the biggest guy at my gym, I think, right now. I'm not the strongest, but I'm the biggest. And I can see the faces on the smaller guys when I get paired up with them sometimes, and I'm like,
Yeah, that's fun.
It's a gigantic advantage. It's a disadvantage for training, because my technique doesn't my technique suffers because I can sort of just use my weight and my strength to get out of a lot of things.
Yeah, it's definitely tougher with size. I know guys that never really, especially with striking, never got very good timing or defense just because they had a huge amount of reach.
Yeah.
But I think eventually everybody gets there, even if it's a little bit harder. If you
I'm slowly getting better. But gosh, I'm 44, so the stamina is my biggest issue. It's just hard to keep up with these young guys who just can keep going. Like the 20-year-olds, they can just go forever. I think I actually rolled with a teenager today, and I was just like, I cannot. He's too fast. I got 100 pounds on him, but
yeah, it's tough. With what was it? You got to find like a purple belt or something that can just do inversions and delahivas all day to mess with you, because those are the guys that I think kind of negate the size difference in jiu-jitsu.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I
Huge
had
fan.
one this was probably a year ago, and I was about a year in this like one purple belt, and I literally had 100 pounds on him, and he just put me through the ringer. He was like this. He scampered up my back, triangle choked me from behind. I had no idea what was going on whatsoever. He wasn't even trying, and I was blown away.
Yeah, it's crazy. The really good guys seem like they have like extra limbs.
Yeah,
That's
the speed at which he took my back was just like mind-boggling.
yeah. That's I'm a more recent comer to jujitsu and grappling in general. I wish I got into it earlier because I think it's much easier to get into with like high school wrestling or something.
Oh yeah, the kids who are wrestlers are just like they're next. Like I have a buddy who's about my age that I grew up with, and he did wrestling. And he got into jiu-jitsu about the same time as me, and he's getting gold medals in like competitions for white belts now. It's like, okay, this is
Yeah.
a little bit of an unfair advantage.
The conditioning's insane. It's
Yeah.
probably the high school sport with the best overall conditioning.
Yeah, I've seen that whatever the Instagram meme that says something that's like, you think you're in wrestling shape, you're gonna go stop playing football, go do wrestling, you're not in wrestling shape. It's
Yeah, nah.
it's the most brutal from what they say.
Yeah, I mean, even coming from me, my base is in striking. I was never a grappling guy until, like I said, pretty recently, and just the conditioning of it is unreal. After my first couple weeks, all of my joints, I would go home and my joints would just be immobile. And I work out all the time.
Yeah.
Do pretty intense cardio, and when I was doing that, I realized that it's a very different it's a very different mindset and a very different body style for grappling.
At my age, I was just having recovery problems, and like literally I slept in a different bed for a week, and my back was screwed up for like 2 weeks. And I was just like, forget about this. I started taking TRT, so hormone replacement therapy. And it's like, that was night and day for me. I don't actually I'm a little bit sore today because yesterday was pretty rough on me, but like almost not sore at all anymore. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, the recovery is tough. I mean, I wrote something about this recently, I think, talking about stretching. And I just hope that I can get the message across because if you gain flexibility when you're young, it's a lot easier to maintain it rather than try and develop it later.
Oh yeah.
Actually, yeah, I did write something about this. I had seen when I was doing karate, there was this Korean guy who was like some higher up in the organization in his 70s or 80s, something like that. And that guy could put kicks above his head like a teenager.
Yeah.
And it's just because he had never stopped, he had never let it atrophy, he'd never let it perish as a skill. And I think that applies in a lot of ways, fitness wise. If you start early and then you just maintain it, it's a lot easier than trying to gain it later.
Yeah. Listeners, I can vouch for this as a 44-year-old who never did shit before. It's pretty freaking hard. So
Yeah, it's definitely tough.
So with martial arts training emphasizing like personal accountability, and as we talked about, having much more clear-cut outcomes, how do you think that this mindset translates into other aspects of life, and what are lessons to be learned from embracing this kind of philosophy and training?
Well, for one, you don't lie to yourself about anything because it's very hard to. I'd say it's impossible to deceive yourself of your own abilities if you're sparring and fighting regularly.
Yeah, and you have to be sparring, right? Like you have to be
absolutely
trying to strike or submit the other person and get them to quit.
Yeah, 100%. You need that, and that a lot of people talk about like McDojos and bad martial arts teachers and stuff nowadays, and 99% of them would just be solved if they sparred.
Yeah, it would be
That's
over.
it. That's the main thing. People ask me, oh, what should I be looking for in a school, or what should I be looking for in an instructor or a coach? And it's like, all right, are they fighting? Are you guys fighting regularly?
Right.
That's it. That's the only thing. You have to fight.
Yeah, it's I did you hear the story of like that Chinese MMA guy who like went around beating up all of the masters and like his social credit score dropped to zero and like couldn't
I didn't
travel
know about
anymore?
that.
Oh my God, you gotta, it's such a sad thing. The guy was just like, he learned MMA and like was just like, these guys are bullshit. And he embarrassed all the traditional stuff. And like, they basically made him a social pariah.
No, I've heard of him and I've seen some of his some of the
Okay.
articles and stuff about his fights. I didn't know that he was persecuted in any way for it.
Oh
That's
yeah.
that's
Yeah. Like
unfortunate.
it was not good. You know, don't embarrass the regime apparently. And traditional
Uh,
stuff is apparently embarrassing for them.
yeah, I think China's going through some modernization with their martial arts. They're trying to turn wushu into the sanda or the sanda competition form.
You would imagine that they would want that as a tradition, right? Like
Yeah, it's I don't
with
know.
like a military, like they're a military country to an extent. You would imagine that like you want the Jocko Willinks in their special forces or what have you, learning real techniques and real ways to to use martial techniques.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think the thing with them is that they recognize it, but they're not allowed to, or they don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
So in backroom discussions, they'll say, "Okay, well, this is very embarrassing, and we should probably fix it." But public facing, it's oh no, it's perfect, it's amazing. Don't question it. We're changing it for no reason whatsoever. Like,
Yeah. Oh, so let me ask you some questions about some of your articles that I read of yours. Um,
yeah, absolutely.
in your article about the Great Pyramids and Pizza Hut, you draw a stark contrast between the ancient wonder of the Great Pyramids and the mediocrity of Pizza Hut. I really loved this. How do you think our society has devolved in the terms of appreciating and creating beauty? And what do you think it would take to rekindle this kind of appreciation?
Well, for one, thank you. I honestly forgot about that. That was my first article out. But yeah, beauty is another element that we've sort of, uh, I guess, either become inundated with or become hostile to an extent that we deny it, both the existence of it and the furtherance of it. So we just don't create beautiful buildings. We don't create beautiful art. I mean, we do, but it's not for public consumption. It's not mainstream, so to speak. And there's a lot of people that say that all the time. It's a very well agreed upon thing that our visual output, our society's, let's say Western society's visual output, has decreased in quality over the past 50 or so years. And there's a lot of reasoning behind it, but ultimately I think the only solution is to recognize it and push forward. um, with that article in particular, I was just talking about it at a personal level, because you can recognize that a lot of things in the world and around you are disordered or ugly or just very sub ideal, but you can take actionable, like, physical steps to do something to make your part of the world at least a little bit more beautiful.
Yeah, I feel like people are in this state of like anything can be this mindset that like anything can be anything, any type of body is beautiful, any type of art can be, gorgeous and appreciated. And it's like, no, it, it, I
Like,
feel
no,
like
it
when
can't.
people are being honest, they know this isn't true.
No, absolutely. And to an extent, I was listening to, who was it? Mark Andreessen,
Mark
the
Andreessen?
guy Andreessen. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. He was on Joe Rogan a while ago. I had a road trip, so I was listening to that, and he said that progressivism and modern, let's say, wokeism functions a lot like a religious society,
Hmm.
and in a lot of ways, it's based on American evangelical Protestantism. And I think a big part of their ethos, their that religious element to it is you have to prove yourself willing to deny basic realities about life. You have to be willing to basically prostrate yourself in front of the altar of mediocrity and say that 450-pound people are beautiful. And
Yeah, I
it's
think that's exactly right. And I wrote a tweet about this at one point where this was more in relation to like certain people and ways of being, where we've now kind of taken what I would call the fringe and elevated into the center. And it's people are confusing the acceptance of fringe ideas and not wanting to persecute people on the fringe with the archetypes that we look up to in our ideals and we model and we have historically modeled ourselves after. And it's very, and this is where I think we lose this ideal of beauty that children can obviously recognize these things. But when you start telling children that the person who runs, doesn't try their hardest, doesn't run as fast, doesn't have as nice of a stride, is at the same level or the same value as somebody who has been running and is a world champion marathon runner their entire life. It's like it's just bullshit. It confuses the children, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a coordinated denial of reality, and everybody involved in it knows that they're denying reality. At least 99% of them do. But the denial of it's a profession of faith.
Yeah.
And that's important to maintain their social cohesion, is to have those professions of faith. And of course, nobody's going to say, well, obviously we're just saying this to, pass this course or whatever. Like,
and this
it's
is
just
like an
social
aspect of a defining aspect of religions themselves, right? You like almost every religion I can think of, in Christianity, it's that Jesus rose from the dead, right? Impossible thing, but yes, he rose from the dead. We all agree this is core belief, and everybody has to accept it. Scientology is a fun one. To get into the inner circle, you learn about things like, oh, we're all made up of thetans, and there was a 747 that brought everybody here to Earth. I don't know it that well, but it's like there's all of these sort of like obvious denials of what anybody would normally accept of reality outside of the religious circle, and this denial of beauty and value seems to be the one that the woke have like decided is their sort of thing that they're going to hang their hat on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that aspect of it, of every religious group having that one, let's say, pivotal fringe belief, it's very interesting, because I wouldn't say that's every religion, but it's almost every religion today. And this is going to be a tangent here, but I'll get there.
This is what we're here for, man. Go on it.
All right. So we talk about like modern leftist wokeism, so on and so forth. That's based on a rejection, like a deep rejection of everything about evangelical Protestant Christianity. They just take everything and flip it on its head. As a result, it's basically just the same, reversed. In terms of structure and philosophy and framing in particular, it's almost identical. And modern, let's say, Protestant revolution then Christianity in general, there's a large focus on the crisis of faith and the method of achieving faith and professing faith, and just faith. Luther's faith alone idea in and of itself just changed the entire course of Christian doctrine and Christian thought and framing. However, if you look at earlier pagan religions as well as early Christianity, they were addressed in such a way by their adherents that they were just seen as self-evident. Everything about, let's say, the Greek pantheon, self-evident. Japanese Shintoism, the idea that there were gods that had at some point shit on fields and made them fertile, that was 100% self-evident to them because the field was fertile. That's how it happened. Hinduism was self-evident and revealed by psychedelic experiences. All of these things just were seen as factual, and we're merely accommodating our beliefs and ritual practices
Well,
around them.
and I think what you're describing here is what we've attempted to do since the Enlightenment is the separation of a description of objective reality through science or rationality and religion, where what you're describing is that religion back then was how you describe the world in its entirety.
Yes, it just was. That was just an element of the world in the same way that there are trees and rocks and the sky. There were gods, and to early Christians who still hadn't reached the uh, let's say Enlightenment framework in any way, it was the same thing. It was simply self-evident. What do you mean you don't believe in this? You just haven't heard about it yet. That was the only way that it was framed, was people who were unbelieving or pagan or so on and so forth just hadn't heard about the faith yet. And that's one element of the age of exploration that a lot of people misunderstand. We secularize a lot in history now, and one of the things that we've secularized are the religious motives behind going out and exploring and converting people. And a lot of times, people today, especially even like mainstream educational material, posits that the religious justification was just a sort of, you know, appeasement to the church or to the public in order to get more resources, land, so on. But at the same time, there were the people that were going on these trips, the missionaries that were going with explorers and profiteers and whatnot, were very much passionate about their project, and the idea, the very framing of that, the only thing that everybody in the world needs is to hear the story of Jesus, essentially. Just they need to hear the story. And we tend to pretend that that wasn't the case, that they were operating on that same faith alone assumption and framework that came after the Protestant Reformation.
I mean, this is comparable to like educational initiatives that the UN or whatever body says, like, oh, we've got to go to these third world countries and make sure everybody gets properly educated.
Yeah, it's the thing about the UN is that they do, in a lot of ways, the same thing as the missionaries, but with whatever prerogatives are out there now. If they could get to North Sentinel Island, believe me, their first priority would be teaching them feminism.
Yeah, I mean, I forget the guy's name who runs this the Department of State right now, but he said, LGBTQ plus initiatives are a top priority for the State Department in advancing the rights in foreign countries.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I guarantee you 99.99% of Turkmenistan does not care at all about that, nor does their government. They're just indifferent. They don't understand it because it's not an element of the culture. Maybe Turkmenistan isn't a great example, but let's say like Uruguay or Malaysia, something like that. It's just not a priority for them. But as far as we're concerned, the Western world order is concerned, they just haven't heard the good word yet.
Yes. All right, so let me ask you another question here I got on my list. The idea of creating personal pyramids and embracing more traditional labor-intensive activities is fascinating. In your opinion, what are some other activities or projects that could help individuals reconnect with their humanity and break away from the modern digital world?
I mean, as in that article, I'm always a big fan of digging a really big hole. I don't think you can get much simpler than that. Besides
What's the
that,
biggest hole you've ever dug?
big.
By hand, I obviously.
Oh yeah. No Lowe's excavator. But
Wow. Okay.
I mean, obviously the main thing I talk about is training martial arts and, making oneself better physically and mentally for combat. I think that's a very simple physical thing that almost anybody can do and very much benefits your mental state, your ability, your confidence, and your philosophical sort of understanding of the world. Besides that, basically anything that involves creating something or bettering yourself in a way that isn't, you know, I cautioned away sometimes from making broad statements because somebody's like, well, what if I want to build another, B2B sales as a service company? I'm like, okay, it's not a bad thing, but it's not what I'm talking about. Just do something physical, gritty, makes you sweat, and makes you better off in some way at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, for me, the only thing, because I tried working out in my like late 20s or so. I did some heavy lifting and whatnot, but it never really took for me. Even though I did enjoy it to an extent. What really got me into doing physical work was Burning Man, where I don't know how much you know about Burning Man, but it's, in the desert for a week. I actually go for now like almost 3 weeks in the desert, helping set it up and take things down. And and I was doing at least a lot of physical labor in order to set everything up. And there was this, and the conditions get incredibly harsh. It's, the sun is beating, the air can be filled with sand, but being able to push through that and accomplish the mission anyway was really like my first sort of foray in that kind of that feeling. And I'm like, shit, I love this. This is amazing. And you're doing it with a group of guys and girls, where you're all struggling and suffering together, and it's a pretty amazing feeling.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have not been to Burning Man, but I've heard a lot about it. And going into the desert is that's definitely a factor. One of the other things about, doing one of the other examples of physical things to do is go somewhere like not necessarily uncharted, just somewhere unsupported. And middle of the desert definitely counts for that. That's pretty hardcore. But you
Yeah,
can go to a mountain or anything.
and my wife and I talk about it because we actually met there. So it's a pretty special place for us. And we have such an abundance of stuff in this world, so many luxuries, so many comforts. And what you do in this environment at Burning Man is you create scarcity that you wouldn't otherwise have. So you're not able to get all of the things you need. When somebody gives you a gift of like a lollipop or a freeze pop in the desert, you appreciate it so much more, even though it's a 10-cent thing. The joy that it brings you it's memorable, and you're with other people who are also doing this like created scarcity thing with you. And even though, you could leave anytime, you're it's not a permanent thing. You do get that sort of experience out of it, or at least I have.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, anybody that's done something very physically difficult or just difficult period gains an appreciation for, uh, I'd say, the things that we usually take for granted. And I mean, recently I went on a hike and it was supposed to be like a 5 mile short hike, and we ended up taking a wrong turn and it turned into about a 20-mile hike to get back to the car in the middle of nowhere. Um, and we didn't bring anything with us, by the way. We had
Yeah.
like a bottle of water max, and it was about 95 degrees out.
As my wife would like to say, she's a big hiker. This is how people die.
Yes, we weren't in like uncharted territory. There were people around, but it wasn't, there wasn't a general store or like a gas station to stop at. So, but when we got back to the car, we stopped at this absolutely terrible diner, and food was like $3 for 2 eggs or something like that, and it was the best eggs I've ever had in my life. Like,
Best eggs ever.
Absolutely, yeah. It just changes how you perceive things. And in the same way that, I mean, not to just talk about fighting, but you train and you fight somebody that's really good. When you watch a UFC fight, you're a lot more hesitant to go, "Oh, come on, man, how can you let him do that?"
Oh, yeah.
Like
Yeah, I
the
mean
experience of
now
things is important.
even I'm not I don't know enough about I know enough about fighting that I can watch the UFC and I can sort of tell most of the stuff going on. But the when I hear somebody who really knows what's going on and they break down like the individual micro movements, like the different things like John Jones will do to like put his weight on an opponent and capture a leg, it's like the amount of appreciation that I have that he is so cognizant of doing those things that seem like such minor details and get them all right under the most extreme circumstances and makes it look so easy blows me away because I am under far, far less strenuous conditions than I do, and I get everything wrong so
Yeah,
frequently.
it's incredible. It's in the same way that that applies just with sports and skilled activities in general too. Like people for a long time went and watched professional baseball because a lot of people played baseball, and you're watching it at the highest level. I'm just using this as an example. I don't know if the stats necessarily back this up, but let's say a lot fewer people play baseball regularly now, and you watch it as an activity in and of itself, rather than knowing innately not just what's going on, but all of the factors that go into what's going on.
Yeah.
And to me, that I mean, I basically I only have that with a couple of things where I know all of the factors that are going in. Fighting is one of them, and it just gives me a completely different view on it. And I think that having that view based on experience is extremely important just in life in general.
All right, let me ask you. I got another one off the list here. We're going to move into some of your comments on film.
A lot of people got mad at me for this one.
Oh, did they? Okay, let's. So, okay, before we get into it, what did people get mad at you about?
Well, I said that Everything Everywhere All at Once wasn't very good.
Can I
And
tell you? I hated it. I
yeah,
turned it
I
off in the
was
middle.
not a fan.
I was watching it with my wife and my in-laws, and we all sort of I think it was after the fingers turned into dildos scene. And I'll tell you, it's not it's not the inappropriate problem that was like difficult for us as a family watching it. That wasn't that big of a deal. It was just the inane stupidity of all of this random shit that they threw in there that were and we all just kind of looked at each other at one point and just said, "Hey, is anybody enjoying this?" And not a single
Yeah.
person was like, "Yeah, I want to keep watching." We're all like, "Yeah, let's shut it off."
See, it's not just the inane stupidity of it. It's the fact that it's inanely stupid and it treats itself as like this profound religious revelation about life and existence. And a lot of movies today do stuff like that. That was just like a crowning example for me because it won some Oscars. Um,
Let's spoil this one because I don't know it. How did this end? Like, how did it become this like revelation about life?
well, so just for context, a millennial made the movie, and it was a movie marketed at millennials. So
Ugh.
it ends with the girl's parents apologizing to her.
Oh, Jesus Christ!
That is, of course, the resolution that they want to go for there. Um,
Ugh.
that's it. That's the whole profundity of the movie. That's it. Is hey, you should say sorry for not. I think it was not accepting their daughter as gay fully. Like they did, but not enough. That
That
was
was
the
the
whole. That was it.
that was the moral revelation of this movie.
Yeah, I mean, it touches on some other things about you know
Oh,
banality and or banality of life and appreciating each other and stuff like that. But it's nothing groundbreaking. That was really the core bit of it.
oh my
Uh,
God! So wow,
yeah,
that's
that
a
was
nice
it.
picture. That actually, what popped into my mind was strangely A Few Good Men, which I'm sure you've seen.
Oh
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, you got because I feel like I loved A Few Good Men, like back in the day when I was like, I don't know if I was a teenager in my 20s when I saw it, but I was just like, yeah, young dog sticks it to the jerky 5-star general, and gets him to admit to these terrible things. And then when I got older, I'm like, it's like the supremacy of the young over the old is the message in this, where like without any sort of respect to the fact that like the Marine general has probably been doing this for a while and probably knows a thing or two about training these guys, and the fact that a whole bunch of lawmakers got together and probably made a political decision to pass certain laws on how he can train his Marines, and he violates those rules. It does not strike me as like it strikes me in the same way that where everything all at once, where the parents are the bad guys and they need to listen to the young people because the young generation knows better and has been better educated.
Yeah, it's interesting too, the on a larger scale, the ideas, at least in A Few Good Men. I watched this movie a while ago, I'm not gonna lie, but Tom Cruise's viewpoint on it of, he's proving legal wrongdoing, so I don't think his viewpoint necessarily is important. But the general is saying, you want the truth, you can't handle the truth, you have to make sacrifices, you have to make these difficult decisions, so on and so forth. His idea of this like cutthroat, ruthless, win at all costs thing is depicted as being an old person system of thought.
Yes.
When in reality, for let's say 90% of human history, that was the domain of the young. Completely. Again, I'll go back to World War One. World War One was when we started having this idea that war is when old people send young people to die.
Yeah.
And it was true. I'm not going to say that it's not true. In that case, it was. But again, for most of human history, this idea of ruthless conflict, unconstrained by boundaries, unconstrained by rules, just like feverish total war, was the domain completely of young men. And that the reining in happened from the old. So A Few Good Men and similar, let's just say on similar works on war, really showed the flip there of the old people essentially being the ruthless, boundary pushing types that are more invested in their own like glory and success and their goal seeking, while the young have to rein them into the rules based order. And that's everything everywhere isn't the same because it's not military based, but it's basically the same thing of you have to follow the rules, you have to
now
live a certain way.
If you take this concept of who to listen to back to like let's say Shakespeare, where most people, I think growing up in my age, looked at a play like Romeo and Juliet and didn't get that the message of the play was that you should probably listen to your parents on who to hang out with, because things can go very wrong, very badly. And it was like contrasting this to like, and it seems to be pretty prolific these days, that you're supposed to listen to the young, like the wisdom of the old ages should be rejected, and that there is a new enlightened way of thinking of things.
Yeah, it's funny because again, the young today have been essentially propagandized into having the geriatric ideas of 5,000 years ago. Like the young today they want generally, and I'm pretty young, but they want more rules, more restrictions, more narrow conceptions of what is right and what should be done. Everything has to be hemmed in and HRified until it's nothing. Meanwhile, that was what youth was opposed to for all of human history.
Right.
Even you look at like I wrote about the punk scene recently, and the original punk scene was a lot of young people who didn't want to listen to anybody, who would go and get into these brawls and go to these insane concerts and do a ton of drugs and alter their bodies. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's an expression of that youthful
And it
emphasis
was the
on freedom.
fringe, and it was
Yeah.
explicitly on purpose the fringe, away from the center and the archetypes.
Yes, and the older, let's say, music industry types didn't get it. They were, you need to calm down, you need to do things correctly, so on. Now, punk, the old punks, so to speak, are like not socially, let's say, worked into the fray of the new era, because the new ones are just like during 2020 they're talking about how we need to like lock everything down. It's like,
Oh
really? You're
yeah,
punk? You're
when you had
punk?
Rage Against the Machine, that's my era. You
Oh my God.
coming out saying you really need to go get your vaccination shot and listen to the government. I was like, this shit has got it fucked up.
Yeah, Rage Against the Machine and like Anti-Flag telling you to follow local government mandates is just, it's just peak absurdity, and it's representative of a larger trend, sadly.
Yeah, and I will tell you, like, I don't mind the idea that you should list, like, that young people should listen to authority. I just happen to have a problem with who's the authority these days, and I think that they think dumb things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on the youth and age elements, I mean, I'm largely, I will say this in particular is not like my original strain of ideas. If you're familiar with Bronze Age mindset,
Oh yeah,
that touches on it well. So,
it's funny. BAP, that's BAP, right? Bronze Age
Yeah.
Bronze Age mindset.
Yeah.
This is 2 podcasts in a row where he's come up, but go on.
Yeah, just I just want to clarify that I'm not, not claiming this is my original concept of it, but the thing was that in the past, at least, let's say go to ancient Greece, the youth, basically everybody under the age of like 36, which is where they thought, oh, you might maybe be an adult now. But the younger generation, so to speak, was always out of control, was always too wild, always needed to be reined in.
Mhm.
And now, if anything, it's the younger generation looking at the older generation and saying, no, you need to be reined in. You're too out of control. You're too wild. We have somehow trended away from needing that older check, the wisdom as a check on the, let's say, fire of the youth. And somehow we've managed to produce a youth through propaganda and media and culture that is terrified of that youthfulness in every way.
So you think it's propaganda? So you think it's? How do you think that they are propagandized too? Like, how does it work?
Well, it's a long trend for one, and the biggest push, while there's a lot of individual, let's say, just base level political propaganda about, you should like this policy and not like this other policy and like this system of thought, there's a very large trend away from let's say vitality and vital uncaring sort of philosophy, because it's not even a philosophy, it's just living without asking permission all of the time, and we've managed to harangue people into being scared of that. One of the ways, I mean, I talk about fighting now, you can't fight in school as a kid now
I was
at
talking to my
all.
wife about this the other day. Yeah, I mean, that was true in the '90s also, right? Like my buddies and I, shout out to Ed, who I still speak with. I'll make sure to let him know that he was talked about here. But Ed actually went out and became a Marine. He and I used to play schoolyard ninjas, where we weren't fighting, but we were pretending like we were fighting. We were, whatever, 10 years old, 8, 9, 10 years old, something like that. And, the teachers would come down on us like, oh, you can't do that. You're out of control. And I was like, we're not hurting each other. We're just fucking around.
Yeah, absolutely. And even like there's that element of even like something that might have the appearance of having a little bit of edginess to it, or even just, a fist fight between two like fifth graders that got mad at each other for whatever reason, you can't do it. You get suspended for 5 days or so, both people. And as a result, this particularly interests me with self-defense, because if some kid's getting, bullied or whatever, and they punch the guy in the face, now they're both out of school for 5
Oh,
days.
that's ridiculous.
It's absurd. And the thing is that it creates this culture of learned helplessness. Of
Yeah.
you can't defend yourself. You have to go find a person of authority to defend you for you. And how is that person of authority going to defend you? Oh, well, they're going to send that kid to the principal's office, where they're going to get a mark on their report card. Everything just trends towards being more bureaucratic and more HRified
Ugh.
everywhere, all the way down to childhood. And it's nuts. That's just one small subset, but it's an example that I like to use, because I was just reading about Richard Harding Davis. If you're familiar, he was a journalist around the turn of the
No.
century. Well, he was the foremost American war correspondent for probably about 5 different wars. He rode with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, all of that. He was really out there doing all of this stuff.
Some badass shit.
Absolutely. And he talks about, after his death, his brother published a bunch of his letters, and he talks about his days in school. And he's talking about like getting in fights and arguing with people and socializing with actors and all of this stuff. And while he's like 17 in college. And it's just the idea of doing any one of the things, any one of the 35 different instances that he mentions in his school days would have completely disqualified him, probably from college and definitely from the entire field of journalism today. And he was the greatest journalist of his era.
Oh my God. This is, and by the way, the thing that popped in my head that I want to mention to the audience is that the reason why he mentions socializing with actors is because actors were the equivalents of prostitutes back then. Keep that in mind, Hollywood.
Yeah, and this was right after John Wilkes Booth had shot Lincoln. So actors did not have a good name at the time.
Oh, actors were absolute nobodies until mass media and Hollywood, and you could get films mass produced. They were simply people who got up and spoke the words of other folks for a small audience that maybe looked a little better than average.
Yeah, that was basically it. And yeah, the some of the, let's say, celebrity era, because I don't think we've had a true celebrity era in about 15 years. All the celebrities now are the same.
Tom Cruise is the last real movie star.
Yep, Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Leonardo DiCaprio. Those guys are basically the last true movie stars.
Yeah.
And even, at least in their day, there was, like, their original day, not now. There was some interest and value in it. But now it's just, we're going to introduce the newest, like, trans non-binary Latinx actress with an X at the end, just for good measure, and you have to love them in this terrible movie, or you are a terrible person. And that's our movie star culture now.
It's truly phenomenal.
Yeah, it's just sad, in all honesty. But yeah, we've it's the natural progression, though. You're right, of putting actors on this pedestal, because actors are fundamentally unserious people that are not worthy of necessarily being, the drivers of culture.
I mean, they're professional liars, right? Like and I mean, guess somebody's going to do it, but like you're pretending to be something you're not, and so the skill sets that you are acquiring are not indicative of an honest person.
Yeah, and I mean, in all honesty, I did some theater in high school. Like, I've done some of it, but yeah, like it's not necessarily a bad thing. But when you take the types of people that are meant for essentially like a minor point of interest in a performance, and you make them the drivers of culture, you have, all of them singing Imagine to what was that one about? Was that one about COVID, or was that one about Putin?
Oh gosh, mean, I mean,
Whatever it is,
we were the
you
world
have
was the first
that.
one,
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. You get, I forget who coined it, but theater kid occupied government.
Oh,
It's
100%.
just, it's just brutal. And there's a reason. There's a very good reason that the types that were interested in acting and showmanship and whatnot were largely relegated to this weird sphere one step above the circus for most of human history
Well,
in most successful
and it was the
societies.
French.
Yep.
And what we to go back to I think a central point, what's becoming the central point of this conversation, is that we've taken the French, which are these actors who are professional liars and entertainers, and they have been put up on a pedestal. They've been taken from the fringe and been given the largest audience of the world with you know without real merit, right? Without real achievements. I mean, not to say that I don't like some of the movies and it's not hard to do some of this stuff, but it's simply not the same to be, say, a fighter in the level of difficulty that is than it is to, sorry, Brad Pitt, be Brad Pitt.
Yeah, I mean, just the elevation of the fringe in general seems to be that's a good phrase to describe it, because you see that happening in a lot of
and
areas.
this is where I think people get confused about the fringe, like because there's a lot of talk about the persecution of this group or the persecution of that group, and I don't think most of the fringe or a lot of the fringe should be persecuted. I think some of it should be, not all of it. But confusing the not wanting the fringe to be persecuted with saying that they should be held up with as role models, and it's just as good as our traditional archetypes, I believe is a major mistake that's being made.
Yeah, definitely. I think that there's a need to, at least among the major drivers of media, there's a need to find new fringes, and there's a need to find some new like edge group to become obsessed with for every couple of weeks.
Yep.
What was there was a New York Times article about like black equestrians not having proper helmets for their hair.
I saw that one.
Yeah, it's just absurd. Like, why? This is a non-issue. This is maybe 8 people in the entire country, and it is not that big of a deal. But we need to find some cutting edge subgroup to put up to put on a pedestal as the epitome of everything, which is, again, it's the underdog story, where America, we always have said America loves an underdog. They've been saying that since the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And we've in some ways co-opted that love of underdogs to bad ends culturally.
Yeah, it's in my last conversation with Michael Gibson, he talked about how Nietzsche said that this was the lineage of Christianity, right? Like it's basically, it was like you had Jesus being the ultimate underdog that sacrificed himself, and that since then that the Western world has become more and more about putting the underdog and the outlier up on a pedestal, and it's ended up making us very confused. I'm sure I'm not doing Nietzsche justice there, but
No, you're right. I mean, he talks about Christianity being essentially slave morality, and
yeah,
I mean, I agree on Nietzsche, or I agree with Nietzsche on a lot of things. On that point, I partially do agree with him, despite the fact that I am Catholic. It's a very particular brand of Christianity, though, that
yes.
presents this issue. It's not, it's not
because
like mainstream.
What they're missing here is sorry to interrupt you there. What they're missing in it is that Jesus, in my opinion, is that Jesus sacrificed himself for the benefit of the community, not for his own freedom, not for his own identity, not for for any other thing other than to bring wisdom and teaching and forgiveness to the masses.
Yeah, absolutely. And the take on Christianity that particularly does fall into that slave morality element is the emphasis on meekness. And while you know, that is an element of Christian faith, it is not the foremost element of Christian faith. It
But
is not the defining element of Christian faith.
but
And
how do you
many
use the
people
word
would.
meek? How what does that word mean, and how you're using it?
Well, today, meekness is taken by a lot of religious thinkers in the public sphere to mean essentially being a pushover.
Right.
And
I think that's wrong.
yeah, it's just not a correct interpretation of the Bible,
Right.
nor is it a correct interpretation of any element of Christian philosophy. Turn the other cheek is true to an extent. There is the problem with anything in Christian thought is that in living in Western society, we're steeped in 2,000 years of tradition of
Yeah.
Christian thought. We've had 2,000 years of development and refinement of Christianity in many different ways. So any phrase that you can use to describe an aspect of Christianity has been used by someone else to describe something else. So if I say, oh, meekness is not necessarily good, it's like, okay, well, what about Thomas Aquinas' view on meekness? What about that? And it's like, that's not what I'm talking about.
Well, what was
So,
Thomas Aquinas' view on meekness?
in all honesty, I have no idea. I'm
Okay.
just taking that
No
off the top of my
worries.
head. But,
Well, how do you use the word meekness?
well, I use it now to mean what a lot of people interpret it to mean, which is that Christianity is only good, and Christians are only good when they are persecuted.
Hmm.
And that persecution is in and of itself religious.
So when I say the meek shall inherit the earth, what does it mean to you, or what should it mean?
To me, it means the people who are well, let's say, again, the phraseology issue comes in here, because if any phrase you use will have multiple meanings.
Mhm.
People that are invested primarily in their faith and in their selflessness and focus on becoming better and becoming more, let's say, holy or more
The people
pure.
that realize that they have a long way to go.
Yes, people that realize they have a long way to go. That is a good way to
Yeah.
describe it.
Yeah,
And
I mean, because I think of it as humble, which is very similar to that. It's it goes
that is
along.
actually the exact word that I was looking for. Humble. That was the word I was looking for.
Yeah,
However,
I mean, because it makes so much sense to me. And I was um, it's the people, the people who get crushed by the world are the ones who are so arrogant to think that they know everything. Those that are humble and that are able to say, like, I have a lot to learn, there's a lot that, like, I don't understand, are the ones that will survive, because they're going to take actions that will reflect that humbleness and prepare them for the things that they don't understand.
yes, absolutely. And we also have to think that I don't want to, at the danger of using like a left-wing talking point, the Bible was in fact written 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And
Yes.
meek meaning, meek had a very different connotation as when, it was somewhat normal to just kill somebody over insulting you.
Well, and that's the turn the other cheek thing. It's like people have to understand that they're writing about an age where the Romans were occupying Jerusalem, right? And this was a military force that had and the culture there was exactly like you described, that like the great people, if they were slighted by somebody, could just kill them.
Yes, absolutely. And even with strike that, in Jerusalem, let's say year 1, the environment of, first of all, violence, and also of top down, self assured, bureaucratic control by the Pharisees was very different than I think we realize it was. And as a result, we take ideas out of the Bible and we apply them in ways that if it was written today, would make a lot of sense, but make absolutely no sense coming from the source text or, again, the 2,000 years of history the faith has had. I mean, this is the faith that in 1097 got up and said, all of us are going to put aside all differences and take back Jerusalem. That is not a meek faith. That is not a meek thing to do.
Right.
In the modern meaning, let's say.
It's certainly not I'm not that it's okay not to get up and do any exercise and eat and play video games all day and drink myself to sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another element of people using the philosophy, because a lot of times people will latch on to an ideology or religion and then use it to justify their lifestyle that they were going to have anyway.
Yes.
And they just want to put a philosophical sheen on it, essentially. They want to have justification for laying in bed all day.
Yeah, I mean, which is also, it's funny, that reminds me of what Nietzsche said about all of the philosophers over time, that they were just really justifying their own neuroses and pathologies through their philosophies. And I guess we're all like that.
Yeah, that's a fundamental human trait, but you have to recognize it in order to, grow beyond it. And with Nietzsche in particular, talking about Christianity being this slave morality or this fetishization of the weak, you see that today in the groups and they're justifying their response to conflict, or rather their non-response to conflict, by saying this is what true Christianity is. They're basically going,
Right.
okay, I don't want to respond to these people attacking me, whether it be physically or in the media or at our church. So I'm going to say I'm in the moral high ground because, the Bible says meek. Absolutely. And again, this is the faith that retook Jerusalem. Like, it's not, I don't know how you don't see a disconnect in that, but then again, a lot of Protestant churches say that the Crusades were immoral. So there's even Catholic clergy that says that the Crusades were immoral. I despise that idea.
Okay. I mean, I think that any culture or religion or people that stand the test of time have to feel that their way of living is superior to those around them, because otherwise, why wouldn't they change? And two, that the successful ones tend to have the property of wanting to spread those cultures and beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. Christian Europe even through the Middle Ages, which we slander as the Dark Ages, the standard of life and the spiritual existence in Europe was just miles better than anything surrounding them, essentially. And as a result, when, let's say, 736-ish, about mid 8th century, when the Umayyads came in and they wanted to take over Spain and Gaul and all of that, they would offer conversion, and they would say, you convert and you will be taxed at the same rate as us, which is basically nothing. There's no issues. You just worship at the mosque, so on and so forth. And people said no, and they were killed because they did not want that standard of life. They didn't want that spiritual existence. And that's out of a sense of knowing and seeing some level of, let's say, superiority. Now, people today might say, if that happened for some reason, they might say, well, Christianity is strong for its adaptation of other cultures. That's why I take out my prayer mat 5 times a day, so on and so forth. Like, it's a little bit crass, but it's just an example. And I think for Christianity to have any future, it has to find some of its confidence back.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I'm going to bring this in a slightly different direction, because I just realized I had a question perfectly lined up for your mentioning of Bronze Age mindset. Can you provide an explanation or overview of what frog Twitter is and its significance to the online world?
Oh God, it's difficult. The problem with like any kind of true fringe movement, not the kind that the New York Times is obsessed with, but like a true fringe movement, it's always going to evade description.
Mm-hmm.
And what I don't even know if necessarily frog Twitter is still the word for it, because that was, the Pepe memes and whatnot were a big deal around 2016 and even into like 2020. But now I think it's intellectualized to an extent, um, and become more focused on religion and philosophy. But just for a definition, it's the group of people that are largely dissatisfied with the material and cultural conditions of modern life and think that it can be done better, whether that is through a return to tradition or a some kind of Nietzschean push towards becoming overmen.
So, along the same lines here, what is the 0x and the beginning of your Twitter handle about? Because I noticed that HP Lovecraft has the same start.
Oh yeah, that's so Ethereum wallet addresses start with 0x.
Ah,
So I wanted to, because I was taking a historical figure, I didn't want to just, to pretend I'm like a return spelled with a V guy. Uh, I wanted to kind of emphasize something about synthesizing the old and the new, so I went with crypto.
huh, okay. Are you a big Ethereum guy?
Uh, I mean, I use it.
You use it. Okay.
Like,
What do you use
I'm
it
not
for?
a. I've done some. Like I've just invested in Ethereum. I've used
Okay.
it for a couple of online payments and stuff like that. I think that crypto in general is very interesting for the future. Unfortunately, I don't have the coding knowledge or experience to, necessarily capitalize on it in the same way that others do.
Sure, sure.
But it's definitely going to be a major thing moving forward. And anybody that's saying it's going to become nothing was also saying it was going to become nothing 10 years ago when Bitcoin was like $5 a piece.
Oh yeah. I mean,
So
I think we're in the middle of it right now, man. I'll tell you, like in the past, since the banking stuff with SVB's gone down, you know, a lot of us. I'm a Bitcoin believer, and yeah, I can smell it in the air. I can just smell the fire burning, like and the panic setting in of like people who are, you know, heavily invested in the fractional reserve banking system and the Fed and all of that, and it seems to be teetering. There's far too many comments right now coming out of major players saying that everything is fine. That is a big indication that things aren't fine.
yeah, absolutely. The collapse of banking as a whole is not just something that's like within the realm of possible, but may be verging into something that's in the realm of likely.
Oh, I think it's
Um,
100%. I mean, I don't think there's a doubt that it's going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, in my estimation.
Definitely for an economic crash in some way with banking, but my question is just how, who's going to come out on top at the end.
Oh, I have. Well, that's so. It's the way I like to describe is it's like we're going to go through a phase change, right? We had a particular set of conditions that everybody understood that are going to disappear. What I can't do is predict what emerges and what the set of conditions that follow it are.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I'm not like I would not say I'm very economically well read. I mean, I've studied economics quite a bit, but I'm not as well versed as many of the people that talk about that online are. So I try to leave it to them at least, just because I'm not as knowledgeable. However, with that said, the real estate market's shot. Banking is slowly collapsing. We're looking at another recession likely. We've been in borderline hyperinflationary state for 2 years. None of that spells good things for the current structure of the system. We're definitely going to see some kind of shift in the near
Oh yeah,
future.
yeah. Well, let's bring this conversation back to what you are expert on. And I wanted to ask you about warfare and some thoughts you had on Dune. So, given that you believe, I think this was sort of a tweet thread of yours or something, but given that you believe the future of warfare as depicted in Dune is more plausible with its emphasis on old school hand-to-hand combat rather than high-tech scenarios portrayed in iRobot or Ender's Game, could you elaborate on what led you to this conclusion and any potential challenges you see in the future about this?
Well, we're in this meta, so to speak, of this fifth generation warfare, rather, where propaganda is a huge axis, even bigger than it ever has been in the past. And we're dealing with a lot of unmanned aircraft, unmanned vehicles. We have, informal mercenary groups and insurgencies and social networks and stuff like that, where you're not really fighting against a conventional army in the sense that you were in World War II.
Right.
That's all true. However, the question is the outlook of that. And the long-term outlook for a lot of people in the defense industry is robot dogs with guns on them.
Yeah.
Unmanned fleets or swarms of drones that are like hunter-killer missiles. Super high-level data analytics, crunching out enemy positions, and entirely unmanned offensives into no man's land, essentially. The problem with that, I see, is that everybody's really invested in it, and it doesn't take a lot to completely screw it up. With everybody very much invested in this next generation of warfare, so to speak, you don't need a lot to counter, I'd say, that in terms of technological development. And again, I'm talking on a long time scale here. I'm not talking about like next year. We're probably going to see more of what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, that weird blend of like World War I and 2050 tactics going on there. But long term, if entire offensives are being fought via robots, let's say, that means nothing. There's no meaning to holding a location, let's say, with like a robot dog. You have no true security there, because if you had true security there, you put people there. Right? You'd rather have people closer to the front. So if you have this, notion of unmanned, let's say, soldiers in some way fighting out all of the future wars while everybody controls them with Xbox controllers, that's just not true. Just with any other, huge move in warfare, for example, let's say the Ironclad Revolution, the shift from wood ships to these massive dreadnoughts, that changed warfare, but warfare didn't become that. Mahan thought it was going to become that, essentially. Both armies were going to just have a standoff in the middle of the ocean, blow each other to bits, and whoever was standing at the end would control ocean trade, therefore economically control the other nation and win the war. That didn't happen. We looked for a Mahanian conflict for like 2 centuries, and we didn't. We got one. It was Tsushima in 1905. That was one true, let's say, off the pages of Mahan, conflict, and that ended the war instantly, basically. But the Dreadnought Revolution just made naval control another element of warfare. The submarine revolution that eventually really took hold in World War I made submarine warfare a facet of warfare, not the main event of it. Aircraft, which everybody thought was going to essentially, well, everybody didn't think it, but the Billy Mitchell and the guys that were cutting edge did think this, that aircraft were going to essentially make war useless. Because it's just going to be about air control. That didn't happen. It just became another element of it. It became worked into the larger offensive. Similarly, when the Gatling gun was invented, it was invented as something to end war. Because who in God's name would want to fight somebody who has a Gatling gun? And obviously, that still happens. So all of these new innovations in warfare end up becoming just a subset of it, a facet of it, something to support the main offensive, which is and always has been guys on the ground with small arms or hand weapons going at each other to hold locations. So as technology progresses, if technology progresses in such a way that those guys on the ground with small arms and hand weapons are wearing near bulletproof or completely bulletproof armor, as in Dune, then the shift would not be from, away from humans fighting, but towards humans fighting more. So as a result, I think long term, we're more likely to see more of a return to Thermopylae than a push towards, Balkans in the 90s.
Interesting. So you think that the personal armor or ability to deflect kinetic projectiles from afar will lead people to do more hand-to-hand combat?
I think that's inevitable in all honesty. If that, for example, you want to take a major city and everybody on both sides is bulletproof. What do? You can't bomb the whole thing.
Why do you think people will become bulletproof, or like what leads you to believe that's a thing?
In all honesty, it's not. But in terms of the coming future, in let's say 50 years, cutting edge military technology, that could become very widespread in the same way that nobody believed that, let's say, personal, like everybody having a communications headset on a battlefield was unsustainable or not going to be technologically viable. It's just going to be one guy with a radio box. All of our technology trends towards increasing refinement, and we have very good bulletproofing technology now. And all of our fighting is increasingly done by, at least in the US, our fighting is increasingly done by small groups of elite guys going and doing hand-to-hand quiet stuff, basically. The push there is clearly going to be to protect those guys more. And once that technology is refined into a palatable, let's say, economically viable mass form, you have Dune armor. Now, do I think that's the only future? No, I think that's just one potential way of going at it. But even if that doesn't happen, unmanned warfare is still going to become just a subset of larger warfare, in my view.
All right. So a little bit more on warfare, but back to film also. When it comes to portraying the historical warrior ethos on screen, how well do you think filmmakers have done in capturing the essence of these philosophies, and where might they miss the mark? Like, what movies do you enjoy the most too that represent this well?
Recently I rewatched Troy, and I really did like Troy.
Troy, I don't think I've seen that one.
That, funny enough, it's Brad Pitt, but he's.
Was that the one with the Achilles in there as a black man?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
No. It's
no.
It's a very historically straightforward adaptation of the Iliad. Now, is it 100% textually accurate? No, not at all. But it's a fun movie, and it portrays the ideas of it well. Other ones, let me think. What have I recently seen? I mean, Predator is just a classic action movie in terms of, this idea of self-overbecoming by conflict. I'm trying to think. War movies overall. There's the problem with a lot of war movies is that very few of them, I forget who said it, but somebody said you can't make an anti-war war movie. And they're right. You cannot make a movie about war without inherently making it look kind of cool in some ways.
Well, because fighting is awesome.
Yeah, it's
like we all have this guttural, and I think this goes back to your men watch this stuff and they go, "Oh, that's badass," right? Like,
yeah. I mean, even if it's trying to, let's say, All Quiet on the Western Front, that's a movie about the horrors of World War One, and it definitely depicts the horrors of World War One. And yet everybody's like, damn, that movie was cool.
But
on Twitter.
Also depicts people overcoming those horrors.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, the prototype of the modern war movie is basically like The Deer Hunter or Platoon. And those are great movies, by the way. I love those movies, but their core message is at odds with what they're depicting. And let's say Saving Private Ryan. The core message of World War II was a brutal, meaningless conflict is overcome by what they're depicting, which is greatness in many ways was forged in the men that fought World War II.
Right.
Now,
like you see men at their best and their worst during war, and they represent them both.
Yes. Evola has really great writings on war and metaphysics of war. I don't think I have the book in front of me, but at one point, I believe it's in that book, he said the blood of the warrior is closer to God than the ink of the writer or the paint of the artist or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
And
sure.
the thing is that when you make a movie that's supposed to be about how war is really bad, what you end up accidentally doing is showing people, it's like the American Psycho effect,
Mm.
where American Psycho is very much a satire of like yuppie white guys that are kind of
Oh my God.
self-obsessed, but at the same time, white guys love that movie. And I like you can only make a point that's counter to certain realities so well in a movie that's going to show those realities. Now, am I a person that thinks war is good? No, absolutely not at all. But the idea that war has, or war, just conflict in general, because again, this extends down to even like arguing with your neighbor. This idea that conflict at all is always bad and offers absolutely nothing to the world, and we should live in John Lennon's Imagine. That is the logical conclusion of the idea. And it's just at odds with depicting war on screen because inevitably people look at it and think it's cool. So there's very few movies that have been honest about what they're doing, like highbrow movies, so to speak.
Do you think that the directors and producers and writers know what they're doing?
I think about half of them have one idea and half of them have the other in a lot of cases. Oh God, what's the? I remember Das Boot being really good.
I'm not
If you've
familiar
seen
with
that, it's a German movie about a U-boat crew in World War II.
Oh, okay.
It's like 3.5 hours long. It's an epic.
So are you an academic? Like, do you research this stuff professionally? Like, because you've got an extent of, you already said that you go on primary sources, and the only other person I know that does primary sources that I've had on my podcast was an academic on Israeli U.S. relations.
I'm not an academic at all. I work in a completely unrelated field, but
so you
it's
just
funny.
Fight and read primary sources on war and history.
Yeah, I wake up and it's just Thucydides and I just do it for fun. In all honesty, it started really when I was in school, and I got really into history, and as a result, I ended up with hopefully a good personal library,
Yeah.
and that's pushed me to be able to get into a lot of things that usually only academics get into.
Yeah, for sure. Okay.
It's one of the things I love about the internet, though. You get guys that are like a clerk at 7-Eleven, and they're writing, the best commentary on like Heidegger that you've ever seen in your life. And
it's like Rise of the Autists, really,
Yeah, it is. It's like, hey man, what do you do in real life? It's like, oh, I mostly drink vodka. It's like, oh, okay. Like,
it's funny, like the guy from shout out to the History of the Land of Israel podcast and Shael, he's the academic I was talking about. And he said, like, he actually started these podcasts and he enjoyed it so much because he got way bigger audience. Like he's got like a premier paper on Israeli U.S. relations. It's like the most cited thing in the area, and he's like, 100x times more people are listening to his podcast than will ever read that paper.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that people really want to learn.
Yeah.
Just all the time, people want to learn. And academia sort of insulating itself into this, exclusionary environment has done a great disservice to the average person who just wants to learn something. Especially the age of the internet has really shown that more than anything. That
well, one of the things I've talked about in my other podcast, and really I think that what I try to do with my podcast is you've studied some Greek history and whatnot, so the idea of the dialogos, where it's a conversation between two or more people where they're exploring ideas earnestly and honestly, and often with an audience. And that used to be a very small scale thing. You just couldn't have these conversations that could be consumed at scale. But in the past, thank you, Joe Rogan, since the Joe Rogan effect has taken off, that there is just this unlimited appetite for learning through conversations like this, as opposed to sitting down and reading. Like, I find reading books tedious compared to listening to podcasts. Like, I find I learn far more. Now, I enjoy reading a book if I want to get down into the specifics and nitty gritty of some things. But, as far as the breadth of things that I now understand, most of what I know about philosophy and religion, I've learned from podcasts these days. Almost everything we've talked about today are ideas that I've gotten from other people talking about them, not from reading about Nietzsche directly, but from other people talking about what Nietzsche said.
Yeah, definitely. The effect of the internet with like bringing awareness to ideas that were once only in the realm of guys with PhDs or, graduate students. It's amazing on one hand, but on the other hand, it's created, I don't know, some issues with the PR of academia, wherein they feel threatened by this and many times basically say, I have the credentials, you are wrong, no further explanation. And that instinct, and sometimes they are correct that the other person is wrong and they're being stupid and that they should listen to the person with the credentials, but they never engage with it, and as a result, nobody listens to them.
Yeah.
Other times they just use the credentials as a shield and it further discredits them. So you have some issues with the spread of information. And I like Joe Rogan in particular. I just listened to a couple of his podcasts the other day. And because he brings on people that are, they don't talk about their credentials on there. They just talk in depth about the stuff that they're interested in. And Joe also, even if he knows absolutely nothing about it, will engage with them as another person would, which is something that many of the academics pretend that you shouldn't be allowed to do.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. I have a huge amount of respect for Joe Rogan and his style and going about it, and I've modeled this podcast as much as I can around that. And I think specifically the long format aspect of it, because it's very, it's very easy to just stay on script if you're only talking for 5, 10, 15 minutes. Once you get over an hour of talking to somebody, it's like you're either talking to them as a real person and having a real conversation, and the guard starts to get let down, or you're getting really uncomfortable and it's weird and it doesn't work. Like I haven't had a guest yet that I felt after about an hour or so, it's like, oh, we're getting into a groove. We're enjoying this. This is, just two guys talking.
Yeah, definitely. However, if you think about it, if that podcast didn't exist, imagine him pitching that to somebody for funding right now. It would get absolutely nowhere.
Yeah.
Because people just pretend that there's no desire for this, when in reality, there's a huge desire for it.
Yeah, he was kind of a unicorn, especially with, because he's all of what he has done with his two specialties, fighting and comedy, is that those are two of the most brutal things on the planet. It's sink or swim, right? And he has to be so honest with himself about what's working, what isn't, and trying to get better over time. That he's learned from those disciplines that I don't know how many other people could have done what he did.
Yeah, that's definitely true. He is a unique guy. But just in general, the podcasting in general has gone up by probably 1,000% over the past, 5 years.
I was looking at the projected revenue of podcasts, and it's something where in the low double digits, like somewhere around $20 billion a year, and it has a projected growth rate of 30 to 40% a year for a while. It's absolutely nuts.
Yeah, in terms of information based or media based industries, it's got to be one of the fastest growing ones.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's eating everybody's lunch, and it's just so much more refreshing to me to sit and listen to a real conversation than something scripted on cable TV. Like
Oh,
we've
absolutely.
gone through 8 different gatekeepers to get in there, and everybody knows exactly the role that they have to play. Like you and I didn't talk at all, and I never talked to any of my guests. Actually, I talked to one. I felt like he needed it. I won't tell you who, but about what I'm going to ask. Right? Like I just don't. We just sit and have a conversation.
Yeah, it's definitely. You talk about the dialogos. That is how that's pronounced, right? My Greek is terrible. I
That's
don't
how
know.
That's how my buddy, the meaning monkey, who was like my second or third guest, I think he described it. He and I had that conversation, and he introduced me to the term, and I'm like, I like that.
Yeah, even the idea of not necessarily just dialogue, but also debate was
Yeah.
the main way that people consumed high level information for a long time, outside of, let's say, like the Bardic tradition or something like
Mhm.
that. You'd see high level discourse mostly at debates that were widely attended by whoever could go there. Even the early Christian councils were like, off the top of my head, I can't remember the specific one, but there was like this huge audience of people just like trying to listen outside at the windows. And I think it was in Constantinople, but it's just crazy. They had to use the monks as like security guards.
So let me get back to my questions here. I wanted to dive into, because I really enjoyed this one too, on your commentary on the samurai and the Vikings.
Awesome.
So you've delved deep into the spiritual connections between warfare and religion in both the samurai and the Viking cultures. These societies independently arrived at similar ritual practices despite having no contact with each other. What do you think this reveals about the universality of human experience when it comes to combat and spirituality? And could you
Well,
describe some of these practices for the audience?
oh yeah, absolutely. That was probably one of my favorite pieces of research I've done, because I was just into this. Like, half the stuff I was looking at was historical primary sources, and the other half was just absolutely schizophrenic 19th century ramblings, and that was fun. But the the samurai and the Vikings, I started to see some similarities because I was looking at magical practices across cultures. I was really particularly interested in not the occult stuff, but like the popular religious practices of the time. And in Japan, coming from like a Japanese martial arts background, I was somewhat familiar with their take on Zen Buddhism and their take on, specifically the samurai's take on Zen Buddhism. And a lot of what they did was based on going essentially away from, prior to a battle, going away from civilization and shedding a lot of their um, not their humanity, but rather their human constraints. And they were focused on, being completely in the moment, becoming pure like flow state. Nowadays we'd say, theta brainwaves, so on. But they wanted to enter like almost a state of religious meditation or prayer when they entered combat.
Mm.
And I saw that and I was thinking, this could be in some way analogous or maybe even opposite to the Viking tradition of berserking,
Mm.
which berserking really arose originally out of the Proto-Indo-European expansion. It was a relic. It was one of the last relics of their warrior culture that remained very similar in structure into the Iron Age, the Norse Iron Age. And their practice was essentially that prior to some kind of violent event, a battle, a raid, something like that, you individually or you with a couple of other people are going to go into the wilderness for a bit away from everybody. You're going to dance and meditate and chants and do rituals. And it really wasn't like you're going to, mix these things and do a sacrifice. And it wasn't like occult rituals out of the Key of Solomon or anything. These were folk religious traditions, right? They were around a campfire. Have you seen the Northman?
Yes, I was going to ask you about the
Yeah.
Northmen, so go on.
The berserker ritual in that is quite accurate in a lot of ways to what a lot of historians can tell happened. They don't think that there were any like sacrifices or any kind of prayers really. It was just, you're going to sing, you're going to rewild yourself, you're going to, you're going to lose all of the stuff in your brain that constrains you and replace it with religious or bestial, uh, let's say, inspiration. And as a result, when Viking berserkers went into battle, they had zero, fear or reservations. They had zero. Some accounts said they didn't bleed. They were going in naked fighting when most people were wearing armor. And sometimes they'd wear like a bear skin over their back and they'd be gnawing at their shields. That was the main thing that was a commonality across sources of cultures that experienced Viking raids. The thing that they really found odd was that they were like biting at their shields and snarling and on all fours and all of this. And the thing was that they then proceeded to slaughter people in combat. And at the same time, you look at back to Japan, you look at accounts of very, very famous samurai or duelists or anything like that, and they were so clearly so far superior to their opponents that it shows in the historical record. And as a result, you see, okay, clearly both of these ritual practices worked in some way. Clearly there's something of a similarity. You're going to leave society and you're going to remove some part of yourself or focus on another part of yourself. And then you're going to enter battle not as yourself, but as something else. Right? Now, a lot of modern historians, again, non-secular historians that are approaching things from a anti-war, anti-conflict perspective, basically said that this was to stop PTSD. The thing was, because the idea of wearing a mask, essentially, it's, I didn't do that. I was a bear when I did that.
Oh.
On one hand, that makes sense, but then you look a little bit deeper into it and there's zero backing whatsoever for it. None at all in either culture. There's no idea of, I killed people, I feel bad about it.
Yeah,
in Viking sagas.
I don't remember. Like, I think I've read somewhere that PTSD wasn't really a thing until the modern era, World War One.
As far as I can tell, there were people that had experienced traumatic things and had symptoms that today would be seen as PTSD. But the idea itself of PTSD it exploded after World War One.
Yeah.
Like, that was really the war that did it. And prior wars to that, I talked about this a while ago, but there's, what was it? There's a decompression period between an older war, between when you get there and when you go home. You're marching for weeks at a time. That gives you a period to ramp up and then a period to decompress. And also the battles themselves were often far lower casualty affairs. Okay, Assyrians aside, every time I bring this up, somebody says the Assyrians were different. Assyrians aside, they were psychopaths, but the other than that, the battles of the ancient world all the way into, let's say, like up to the Civil War were a lot lower casualty rate in many instances. And when they were higher casualties, often it was executions after the battle was over. The actual affair itself wasn't usually a slaughter to the last man. It was usually a rout. So as a result, there's a lot less.
Most of the people on the one side, even if they lost, got away.
Yes, in some sense. I mean, disease was a bigger deal.
Yeah.
So a lot of times you have armies with very high fatality rates, but most of those fatalities were from disease or starvation, which obviously is traumatic, but it's not PTSD in the same way as we describe it today with like Iraq veterans. That is specifically, in my view, it completely scrambles your brain to experience something that not only comes at you fast, like you go from being in, let's say you're at Paris Island in South Carolina, and then 2 weeks later you're on the front lines in Afghanistan or Syria or something like that. You're getting shot at, and then you just come back and you're immediately back in the world. That's not something that people experience for a very large part of human history. There's also the element of ambushes and low-level stress, which didn't happen as much. And actually, if you want any account of historical PTSD, or or at least an account that's pointed to as PTSD, is usually an account after an ambush.
Hmm.
Because then for the rest of the campaign, or at least the rest of the march to the battle sites, you're worried about that all of the time. You're always on. You're always ready to be ambushed. What do people that were veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan talk about being the hardest thing to let go? The vigilance, the hypervigilance, the low-level stress. So
Right, but
those two things.
you've got you have ambushes, you have IEDs in the
All the
Iraq
time.
Afghani era, and in World War I, World War II, you've just got bombs, right? Like you
all the time. You can just get blown
Yeah.
up at any moment while you're asleep, while you're awake, whatever. It's the low-level stress. And the battles of, let's say, like the Battle of Marathon just does not subscribe to that whatsoever. Both armies showed up after multiple weeks or months of travel, at least for the Persians, and then they were attacked in one huge colossal battle in which most of both sides survived, and then spent multiple weeks or months going back to where they were. Marathon might not be a good example for the long travel, but yeah, there's a decompression period either way. However, back to the on the Viking samurai connection, I just thought that explanation was really flimsy for it, because their battles, at least the Japanese battles, were often pitched, and Viking era raids, usually it was either raiding or getting raided, or a arranged battle, which I would say is a little bit different than a pitched battle, in that they would agree with how many men to bring and where. The armies wouldn't just catch sight of each other and then there's your battlefield. It was we're each going to bring 100 men
They
to
would
this spot
agree
on this
upon the
day.
number of men and the conditions of the battle.
Yeah, usually these were for for smaller scale conflicts between cities or villages rather. Um, yeah, there was one famous account where a guy, I can't remember his name, but one of the leaders disregarded the rules of the battle and brought like 300 instead of 100 men.
Yeah.
And obviously they won, but when he won, he cut the opposing king's head off and hung it on his saddle. And while the guy's head was swinging back and forth, he had these huge buck teeth that cut open the winning king's leg, and he died of that infection.
Wow, that's a
Yeah,
crazy
so
happening.
it was a little story of, nobody knows how true it is, but it was
Right.
a little parable of like, don't screw up the rules, you know?
Wow. Fate
So
would take you out.
yeah. So basically, I just thought that the PTSD explanation was really poor. So I looked at modern sports science and I found basically parallels for a lot of what, you know, a lot of what these practices were. If you think about it today, a lot of fighters go to a fight camp that's like separate from their house and separate from where they normally train before a fight.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that MMA would be the best way to look at this rather than the military, because the military today isn't concerned with optimizing necessarily the abilities of the individual soldier in the same way that it would be important to optimize the abilities of an individual soldier when your army is like 500 people total and raised from the citizenry on like a moment's notice. So I thought that maybe looking at MMA would provide some examples, because you're looking at people who are doing a very similar thing. They're going to get into a physical confrontation with another person, and it's very high stakes. It's very intense, and it's winner takes all. So I thought, you know what, maybe this would be the best place to look for it. And really what I was finding was that basically we do the same things now. We just came to them from science. We have sports psychologists for fighters that are training them in meditation and
Yeah.
mindfulness. And we have fight camps that are away from your normal thing. You go and you become the guy for the fight. You're not yourself for those couple of weeks. You are the guy in the fight, you know? Like Conor McGregor is, he's a bad example. Yuri Prohaska is a better example. He went before his one of his fights. He sat in a dark room for 3 days without food or water, I think.
Jesus.
Yeah, and that was his way of locking in, basically. And we also have studies of like flow states and altered states of mind, and the flow state in particular, which I believe is dominated by theta band waves in the brain, which are associated with like meditation and prayer, makes you, something like 80 times more competent in any physical task and more focused on it. a slight exaggeration, but you can enter this state of pure meditative, you know, pure meditative excellence, really, if you do something a lot and then you focus very hard on it.
Yeah.
Artists will do this, and you hear about artists and writers sitting down to like write something and then they don't get up for 36 hours.
Huh.
Like Stephen King would do that, and that's a flow state. You
I thought
can't
that
do
was the
that
cocaine
normally.
also.
That was the cocaine, and that brings me to an interesting point. The Vikings did it with henbane.
Okay, I was going to ask you because I heard like is it hembane? I thought it was mushrooms.
So the mushrooms hypothesis is a compelling one, but I don't think there was an ethnobotanist, which is a job that I didn't know you could have. It's pretty cool, but an ethnobotanist figured out that the mushrooms necessary for that wouldn't have been growing in enough quantity at the time.
Okay.
And so his counter was that they probably used henbane, which was everywhere.
What is
And
henbane?
it's this small, I believe it's like a little brush type of herb. And it's actually pretty poisonous to you. But if you ingest it, it is hallucinogenic to an extent.
Okay.
And it's not just hallucinogenic. It makes you angry. So
and so it makes you a violent hallucinogen. And did they ever have difficulty telling friend from foe and all that?
Oh yeah, that happened. From what I could tell. The thing is, though, that in modern, they kind of disregarded henbane for a while because in modern toxicology studies, henbane just kind of makes you like lethargic and irritable, I believe are the words used. Not, ragingly angry and meditative. And they're also hesitant to do it because it's part of the nightshade family, and therefore it's poisonous. But
you've also got these like Viking guys who probably got some sort of tolerance to it and got used to it, and maybe they knew how to prepare it a little bit better.
Well, definitely, and there's also the fact that I don't think like that ethnobotanist thinks that it was basically just the henbane. I don't think it was just the henbane. I think it's the henbane plus the ritual plus the removal from society. And if you did that today with people that were, militaristic or fighters of some sort, you'd probably get pretty similar effects. But nobody wants to die of a nightshade poisoning. So
I imagine you're correct.
yeah, I'm not willing to try it. I'll say that. Like, I'm not going to
lie. I'm curious, but probably not going to happen.
The other piece of evidence for henbane was that after berserking, guys would often spend 2 or 3 days like alone in a dark hut because they'd be like violently ill.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, they'd be sensitive to light. They'd have headaches. They'd throw up, and that's something
like they're coming down off of something.
Yes, that doesn't happen with mushrooms.
No, it does not.
So those are the primary pieces of evidence there. So I was looking at it and I was like, I think we probably just reinvented the stuff that these guys figured out by trial and error a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So another question for you. You touch upon the role of Valhalla in Norse culture, where warriors who died in battle were believed to enjoy eternal glorious combat. How do you think this belief in the afterlife reserved for brave warriors affected the mindset of the Viking warriors? And did samurai culture have similar beliefs that motivated them in battle?
Well, the interesting thing with the Vikings, obviously, they're just I don't want to say outstanding, meaning like amazing, but outstanding as in perfectly representative. They're an outstanding example of a warrior culture.
Mm-hmm.
Their men were essentially raised from birth, even if they were very poor, into this idea that they would be fighting, that they would be raiding, and you weren't in certain areas, you weren't considered a man in Germanic or Norse culture until you had participated in a raid. So their entire societal structure was based around this, very almost feudal political structure, wherein everybody had a quite a small area of land and people fought over it all the time. So as a result, you get guys that are just fiercely militaristic and violent, and you see that in their martial arts as well. Glima is the old Icelandic wrestling that's derived from Viking martial arts, and it's just feral.
Okay.
I have no other way to describe it. It is feral. It looks like somewhere between jiu-jitsu and Greco-Roman wrestling, but
Mm-hmm.
just violent. It's all eye gouges and wrist breaks and elbows to the face and just tearing at people. It's like how a badger attacks somebody. So yeah, it makes sense to me, the you know chicken and egg situation, but for a culture to have uh, a valorization, like to the point of religion, of their warriors, of if you die in battle you will spend all eternity in paradise. That's indicative of a very warrior centric culture. However, to me, the more interesting thing with that is not only just that they had a heaven specifically for warriors, but also the fact that that heaven was constant war.
I didn't know that until I read your article.
Yeah, the idea is, oh, if you die in battle, you will go to heaven, and then you will every day spend all day fighting and all night partying.
I love it.
That was their entire concept, and that to me just speaks to a culture that's so unfamiliar and has no notion of like materialist pacifism.
No,
Like
none.
we look for these ideas of, oh well, the Vikings knew that like war is hell. No, they were about it. That was their whole thing. And I think we find it difficult to conceptualize a group of people that can even get together and agree on that.
Well, it's war is hell, but largely for the other guy when you're that good at it.
Yeah, they're also when they were raiding England and other areas, they weren't losing.
Right? Like
Like it wasn't a situation in which you were like a 50-50 shot at losing. It was like 90-10 in a lot of cases.
yeah, I mean
Um,
you're probably not picking the strongest targets either, right? If you're raiding, you're
no, often not at all. And so to them, war was the fulfillment of life. That was their peak, was to go and fight in a lot of ways. Obviously, they also had very strong, social rewards and religious connotations around having children and stuff like that. Things that we still value today, but that one particular value of theirs is one that we just kind of can't wrap our heads around.
now.
Um,
Have you seen the I think it's Netflix show Vikings Valhalla?
I haven't watched it yet, but I've heard a lot about it.
Okay, yeah, it's supposed to be moderately historically accurate about some stuff. They use real people's names and dates and all of
Okay.
that. Yeah, you might want to check it out. I enjoyed it.
That's cool. No, I just haven't seen it yet. I've heard though. I've one of my friends watched it and he said it was very well done. So I'll have to check it out. Oh, you asked about the Japanese as well though.
Oh yeah, yeah. Go on.
Um yes, I actually just wrote an article. I don't think it's up yet, but I wrote an article for Countier magazine about the samurai religious notion of warfare. And they're very different than the Vikings because they're first of all, they believed in reincarnation.
Yep.
And earlier we talked about like the kinds of belief, the belief based on faith versus the belief based on this is what it is. And that was their type of belief in reincarnation. It was just a simple fact of life. If you die, you will be reincarnated 40 days later, something like that. That's just how it is. So as a result, that was probably the most important religious element of theirs. Um, Towards warfare, in that they knew, as much as we know which way is up and which way is down, that when they died they were going to come back. Besides that, the elements of Zen that ended up becoming popular among the samurai were very I'd say unique in that they were focused on what we would probably today call kind of Nietzschean, or a sort of vitalism, where they had these very disciplined lives where they were essentially expected to be quite ascetic. They're ascetic, how do you pronounce it? But they were expected not to enjoy a lot of worldly dilly dallying and pleasures, and they were expected to live very very strictly under a code and very strictly in service of their lord. But out of that, they were expected to find something more profound about life because of that limitation.
Mm.
In the same way that the Knights Templar removed a lot of, like, they weren't allowed to associate with women, they were only allowed to eat meat 3 days a week, they couldn't go do falconry or any of the fun stuff, they couldn't drink, all of that. The idea was that they would have higher moral and philosophical revelations and therefore a heightened martial ability out of it. So theirs was a sort of utilitarian approach to the monkly life of taking everything that a monk does that might be useful for a warrior and applying it.
Hmm.
So that theirs is, it's a lot more complicated. That's another one that Evola speaks very well on. He has this essay, Zen, the Religion of the Samurai, and that's quite well done on that. He talks about meditation in the same. I wish I had found it earlier when I wrote that Viking Samurai article, because he phrases it way better than me about how samurai meditation worked.
Fascinating. And you wrote another, it was a separate article, but you wrote an article about the Christians, and as you mentioned, the Knight Templars. Like, how do they compare to the Vikings and the Japanese samurai?
Well, with them, I'm just getting into a very, a deep dive on them recently. So I wouldn't consider myself an expert on the Vikings or the samurai at all, but I already kind of completed that section of research. So I'm still working on the Templar one. But my understanding there is that they basically wanted to, instead of shifting downward towards the animal in the same way that the Vikings did, or that a lot of their enemies in the Middle East did, they wanted to shift upward towards removing all individual agency and replacing that agency with God. They wanted to act in such a way that it was only as God willed it. They wanted to act in completely in line with religious, not just religious like fervor, but direct divine inspiration. And the idea for that was to basically live like a monk, pray all the time, live by a code, remove worldly pleasures, the same things. And they also had very ritualized like dining and day-to-day living practices that in many ways were sort of reminiscent of the rituals and whatnot of the samurai. So you get a similar drive, I'd say. It's a
So similar to the samurai, but with Christian elements to it.
the difference is that the samurai wanted to better themselves through this meditative state that they would achieve by living in a certain way all of the time, and by bettering themselves they could better their ability in combat and better their ability to serve their lord.
Mm-hmm.
But the Templars, on the other hand, wanted to basically just remove themselves, like their agency, from the equation completely. And it wasn't like this idea of that sounds almost submissive in a way, but it was
Mm-hmm.
a way to basically remove all of the stuff that plagued the knights of Europe. All of the Some of them were quite indulgent in a lot of things and weren't really productive or weren't very good at training all the time and stuff like that. These
I
were
mean, they were
common
kind of
criticisms.
gangsters, right?
Yeah, they were, but some of them had kind of gotten a little too comfortable. um, and I believe Chaucer talks about this at one point, but this is a very common criticism from the church levied against the knightly class at the time, was that they were sort of losing the religious element of it, the moral element of it, and
Mm.
the personal character element of it. And the Templars essentially said, okay, we're going to have to go do something that sucks. It's not good at all. There's no glory in it. There's nothing to be conquered. It's already conquered. All we have to do is protect these pilgrims. And as a result, they wanted to say, well, God wills that these pilgrims are able to make their journeys. We want to embody God's will without any of the excesses and any of the, let's say, inefficiency in battle of the mainland European knights, because they only had a couple of guys. The first group of the Templars was like 9 knights. That was it for the entire thousands of people that were coming in and out of Jerusalem and to other holy sites. It was like
Mm.
9 knights to protect all of them. And there were basically no other reinforcements. So as a result, they wanted to become far more or have far more prowess than their numbers betrayed and their very, very modest means portrayed. Um, for example, their original logo was two knights riding on one horse because they were that poor. So their idea of becoming better as warriors was to act only in line with God, and by doing that, make themselves far more effective on the battlefield. And it ended up working. They were quite well known and well feared.
So I seem to remember reading or hearing somewhere that the Knights Templar were the first sort of like issuers of banknotes, where you could deposit your gold with them and then send a banknote. They would give you a banknote and then you could redeem it somewhere else on the European continent. Does that ring a bell at all to you?
Yes, it does, and they were quite, and especially in their later years, they were quite financial in their aims. But those were so Knights Templar as an organization, they would take multiple kinds of initiates or volunteers. The guys that were in the Middle East fighting the, the bandits, pirates, opposing armies, so on and so forth, were not the guys that were really involved in the political conniving of the mainstream European like economic system.
Mm-hmm.
However, yes, they did offer the first pseudo banking system in a lot of ways, and one of the bigger things that they did was they basically would protect movements of money, and they would act kind of like Brinks does now and move stuff around.
That makes sense. They were kind of like Brinks.
Yeah, that was their bigger responsibility for the European monarchy and for the papacy. But they did all at a later date when they had such large banking, like they had such large vaults of gold and whatnot. They did offer the ability to deposit money at one place and withdraw it at another. However,
Okay,
I would say that
I remember that correctly. Wasn't making.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've used that in conversations before. I'm like, I'll check with Alaric here, see if this is actually true.
Yeah, that ended up being, and they did also offer loans and whatnot, but that ended up being their downfall with King of France.
Shocker.
Yeah.
How did they downfall from that?
Well, the King of France owed them an absurd amount of money, so he declared them illegal, had them rounded up, tortured into confessions, and then burned all of them. Which is a hell of a way to deal with creditors, but it works. And later on, they would go on to be recognized as having been innocent, but the fact that they were a very esoteric order also led them to have rumors of certain like occult sounding rituals and practices and stuff like that. But the largely 99% of it was exaggerated, and the other 1% was shaky at best.
Mm-hmm.
But they eventually ended up, being tortured into confessing to taking orders from like a shrunken, detached head and acts of almost homosexuality. They said that they had to like kiss another guy's belly button or something like that, and it wasn't even euphemism. That was the charge. But yeah, they were all burned as heretics.
What a charge! Oh my gosh! Yeah, so that reminds me of the saying, like when you owe the bank $1 million, the bank owns you. When you owe the bank $1 billion, you own the bank. And it sounds like the King of France owned the bank and decided to dispatch with them because of that.
Yeah. They didn't organize any resistance, which is surprising because they had the means to, but it happened very, very quickly. That's by the way, the origin, if I'm correct, of why Friday the 13th is seen as unlucky, because it happened on Friday the 13th. Yeah, if I remember correctly, that's one of the at least rumors for why Friday the 13th is unlucky.
No shit. Well, Alaric, it is. We have done a good job here, about a little over 2 hours. I got to wrap up, unfortunately. Otherwise, I'd love to keep chatting with. Is there anything else you would like to ask or talk about or promote?
I would just say, if anybody listening to this hasn't seen the Dissident review, go check that out. That's my historical publication. Other than that, yeah, just thank you for having me on. This has been a good time. I didn't even realize it's been 2 hours.
Yeah, oh, good. That's the best way it can go. Yeah, and send me any links you want to post to the podcast, YouTube, what have you. I'll include anything that you want to advertise. And yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, and I'd love to have you on again at a later date. Maybe talk about some more stuff that you're researching when you got more things to share.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for having me.
All right, Alaric. Take care.
You too.